Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Erin McCown. I'm the Director of Corporate Development and Training Services at National EAP. On the line with me today, I have Rita Kakitisa and Jeffrey Schlossberg, who are our expert panelists. I will tell you a little more about them in just a moment. But first of all, I just wanted to thank you all so much for joining us for this important conversation. And just know that we are looking for your participation throughout today's presentation. So there is a side panel where you can type in any questions that you may have. So I always just like to test and make sure people can actually hear us and that you know where that panel is. So if you wouldn't mind just typing into that side panel and say, hi, I can hear you. Or if you have a question, you can submit it. Okay, good. It looks like people can hear us, which is good, guys. All right, it looks like we're good to go. So again, please feel free to submit any questions you have as we go through. We do have some talking points arranged, but we want to make sure that we're addressing the concerns that you have with this important topic of starting a diversity and inclusion initiative in your organization. And I know for so many of you that you may already have been discussing diversity and inclusion before the recent events that have happened this year. And for others of you, this was the moment that made you look at your organization and reflect and say, we really do need to look into something and see how we can expand. So that's why I'm so excited to have Rita and Jeffrey here today to talk to us about how you can get started with a diversity and inclusion program. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about both of them. Rita is an award-winning gender diversity, inclusion, and career strategist, speaker, mentor, and advisor to Fortune 500 companies. She is the founder and CEO of UMA, an international platform that empowers confidence, inspires success, and builds leadership in women and minorities. Rita began her professional career at Goldman Sachs in London, where she was awarded the prestigious Excellence in Citizenship and Diversity Award. She is also a distinguished alumna of King's College London and a triple Stevie Awards for Women in Business winner. Rita actively coaches and mentors business leaders, veterans, survivors of domestic violence, women in technology and STEM, schoolgirls and students on topics around confidence, communications, unconscious bias, and leadership. She also serves as an advisor, ambassador, and diversity and inclusion expert to multiple boards and global organizations around the world. Rita is also a regularly invited speaker and guest lecturer at various academic institutions, multinational corporations, and global policy forums, such as UNESCO in Paris, European Parliament in Brussels, and many more spanning Madrid, San Francisco, Sochi, and Toronto. Rita has been featured as an expert on multiple international television and news shows, interviewed and quoted in various podcasts and publications, such as the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, and Thrive Global, and also hosts the popular South Asian TV show, The UMA Show, on Mana TV International. So thank you so much for being here with us. We're happy to have you. And Jeff Schlossberg is a principal in the Long Island, New York office of Jackson Lewis PC. Mr. Schlossberg has devoted his entire career of 30+ years to the employment law field. He is also a certified information privacy professional with the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Mr. Schlossberg has extensive experience in handling all aspects of the employer-employee relationship. His practice focuses primarily on employment discrimination, prevention, and litigation, workplace policy development and compliance, family and medical leave issues, wage and hour investigations, and litigation and management training. Mr. Schlossberg lectures frequently about various topics to trade and professional associations, is a past chair of the Nassau County Bar Association Labor and Employment Law Committee. Mr. Schlossberg is also a member of the National Personnel Committee of Canine Companions for Independence, a nonprofit organization that provides people with disabilities highly trained assistance dogs free of charge. So thank you, Jeff, for being here with us as well. Sorry, I'm just noticing here people were typing in about the audio. So yes, all attendees are muted. So please, if you have questions, feel free to type it in. And And as we get started, like I said, we do have some questions set up to help us understand and spark some thought about how we can start the diversity and inclusion initiative in our organizations. But we do want to hear if there's any struggles that you are having. And yes, this will be recorded and posted on our website if you are unable to stay with us the whole time. So as I gave everyone your grand backgrounds, and we're so excited to have you both with us to talk about this. The first thing I wanted to ask is, what are some first steps that we should be considering when starting a diversity and inclusion initiative within our organization? If, say, an organization has never really considered how to do this before, how would you recommend that someone goes about starting? And I know that that's a broad question, but Rita, maybe you can start us off with where people should start to think about this.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for having me. I just wanted to say quickly, I can actually hear an audio sound. I don't know if that's what the guests are talking about. There is some sort of a scratching sound in the background. So when I'm not speaking, I'm going to mute myself, for example. So I'm going to try that. But just to respond to your question, I think the first thing any organization should think about is, why are you doing this in the first place? It's very hot on the topic right now, and that's the first question I ask when I'm going in to strategize for a company. Are you doing this because if you're filling a quota? Is it because you have a board of advisors that have asked you to kind of get your diversity inclusion in gear right now? Is it because you've never had one and you're hearing about things going on right now in the news and you think, you know what, we should probably be part of this bandwagon and get on board as well? So I think that's the first thing, to question what is your motivation for this in the first place, and then figure out after that who are you trying to support in this, and what. So you've done your why, and now who are you trying to support? So is it is it your current employees because they already come from a diverse background and you're just trying to help them feel more included? Is it because your employees are starting to leave, so you're looking at retention statistics right now? Is it because you don't have a diverse population, so you're thinking of hiring practices to how to get to more diverse folks in the first place to create then a more inclusive structure? So I think that's the first thing, your who, your why you're doing it. And then after that, how are you going to do this? Have you set yourself a budget for diversity and inclusion? This is something very real. It saves the company, it saves you a lot of money in the long run. There's been a lot of research on there of how having a diverse and inclusive structure helps you going forward, but it also can cost a little money to set something up. You might need to have focus groups internally. You might need to invite professionals like ourselves in to kind of help you set something up. You might need to actually put in plan resources or training for your employees. So I would tell people, make sure you know, how are you going to do this? How are you going to support it? Who is going to look after the initiative once you have it up and running as well? So I think these are some initial steps to think about when you're getting a new diversity and inclusion force set up, really. And it's a really exciting journey. So I think, you know, congratulations to whoever is actually thinking of doing it.
Wonderful. And actually, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind expanding on something you just said. You said, who's going to look after the initiative? Do you have any input on who that should be within an organization? Should it be a role of human resources? Should there be a separate diversity and inclusion specialist? Who do you think that should be?
So that's actually a really good question, Erin. It really depends on the size of the organization. Quite often, some of the bigger companies, some of the multinationals that I work with have an own specific diversity and inclusion group. Now, quite often, some of them might be representatives from HR, but a lot of time that's not the case. They could be senior business leaders or managers from across the company that represent different groups and understand different working roles. So I would suggest that if anyone hasn't got anything set up, you want one point person to start with. It could be somebody who's had experience with diversity and inclusion at the company, who feels strongly about it. Maybe they come from a diverse background themselves. So that could be just somebody to kind of help steering thing. And then you might want representation from across your company as well. somebody who might be from a gender perspective, from a race perspective, ethnicity perspective, from a different background, from the LGBT community, for example, somebody from a veteran background. It really depends on what group of minorities you're trying to fill and how you're trying to get that representation around as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And Jeff, from your perspective, is there anything else that the leaders on the line should be considering when they are looking to start a diversity and inclusion initiative in their organization?
So yeah, hi, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss this very important and timely topic. And I will say, although I'm the legal, speaker, to the extent there are people here who have spoken, who have heard me speak before will know, and for those who haven't, you'll know that I don't only speak, legalese and give legal answers. I bring to the conversation, business strategies and advice that incorporate, legal principles and concepts and use those to support the strategies that we try to help our clients achieve. So to add on to what Rita said, and I think one of the most important things is to get buy-in from the top and try to understand, why is the company doing this, okay? Is this, they're doing it because it's the right thing to do? Are you doing diversity because it's, you want to comply with, anti-discrimination laws? Are you doing it because you think it'll increase productivity? Or are you doing it to check a box and just go, oh, this is the thing to do today, so we better get it done? And, the success that you have in achieving what is so important in the workforce is going to be driven right from the beginning by what your motivation is. Because if it's simply to check the box, it's not going to necessarily go very far. So I think, whoever it is that's responsible, and as Rita said, every organization has different people. There are some in mid-sized companies, maybe you have 100 employees, or, smaller, 500, whatever. It could be that, HR is charged with this responsibility. And whoever it is needs to embrace it and understand what it is. And to this point, actually, I think I'm going to try and show a slide, see if this will work. If I can just try to do this, because I think it's interesting. So let me see if I can share my screen, and you can see here, hold on. So this is, what is diversity? And I guess, most people are probably focused on the tip of the iceberg, gender issues, ethnicity, race, but there's so many other things that we need to understand are out there. And that's, below the surface of this iceberg. And, whether it's sexual orientation or socioeconomic status, all of these types of concepts are things that we need to flesh out and help our clients, our workforce, understand, how broad diversity really is. So that is, a couple of things that I think are really important just to get the ball rolling.
No, and I thank you for that. And I think it is good to see all of the different areas of diversity, because I think sometimes we get pigeonholed and we focus on one area of diversity. We say we want to expand the people of color that we have who work for our organization, or gender on our board, but we get focused on one area, but we don't always look to everything. So I think that was a great visual. Thank you. One thing I wanted to know if you could expand on, Jeff, was you said it's important to get buy-in from the top. How do you do that? Do you have any thoughts on how you can go about doing that? I know, again, broad question, but how could someone start that?
Well, I think it's by educating whoever you are in the organization, educating yourself on understanding what the topic is and what the benefits are, because if you have that information, you'll be a much more effective persuader, communicator, to those that need to make the decision if that's not you. So I think, learning some of that and trying to maybe have a couple of do's and don'ts. One thing that I want to just say right from the outset, because I think a lot of people out there, and this is a legal issue, when you're talking about diversity, a lot of people have a misperception that we need to go out and hire more X, whether it's people of color or women or whatever the issue is that you're trying to increase. But there are significant pitfalls there, because you can't just hire just decide, and have a quota and just say, oh, the next 10 people we hire are going to be, African American or Hispanic or something like that. That's not legal. That is a form of discrimination. There are ways to achieve, and maybe we'll get into it in a little bit later about how to get around that and set goals, which would not necessarily be unlawful. But I think that people need to understand if they're going to go advance, let's achieve diversity, that what you don't want to do is try to tell somebody, let's go and hire and make sure we just automatically hire the next 10 people of a particular ethnicity or race.
Thank you. And Rita, is there anything that you want to ask about how to get buy-in or how to start that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to add to what Jeff said, really, I think it goes back to the why are you doing this in the first place. Now, every company, every organization is different. Your client base is different as well. So I think part of why are you hiring diverse talent is going to be different as well. So you can't lie with you can't sort of change the research, the statistics out there. At the end of the day, if you're a senior leader at a company, you care about returns, you care about figures. Right now, if your clientele are starting to become more diverse and you're going into a different market, for example, during quarantine, during COVID, a lot of markets are having to pivot. By default of having to pivot, they're going into different spaces, so they're automatically servicing diverse clientele. In order to do that, a lot of people like to see diverse employees as well that match what they're trying to service. So I think you can't sort of pigeonhole everybody by saying you must hire more X, Y, or Z, because that is what's coming up in the latest diversity sort of agenda right now. It's really upon what you're trying to do and why. Are you going into overseas markets, for example? Are you looking at different cultures? Where are you hiring from and why? This is all part of the equation too. So it's all about really making your senior leadership understand that, looking back and selling it to them from a numbers and a figures perspective, and then you're surely going to get buy-in at some point.
That's great. Thank you. So if we've gotten the buy-in and we've gotten the go-ahead to move forward with some sort of training, one of the biggest things I'm often asked about is unconscious bias training. And I think it's a bit of a buzzword, people hear about it. So I first wanted to ask if you guys wouldn't mind defining what unconscious bias is for us. And Jeff, I don't know if you want to start on this, and then maybe we can talk about if that type of training is even enough.
Sure. I always tell people that I find that whoever invented or coined, if you will, the term unconscious bias, I think wasn't thinking clearly, with all due respect to whoever it was and whoever I'm insulting. But, if you're unconscious, you're not thinking about anything. It's probably more appropriate to say subconscious bias, right? But that's maybe, my own perverse sense of humor at looking at these things. So what I would like to do is, let me give you, if it's okay, I guess, give you what I think it is. And then let's get Rita's input, but then I'd like to come back, if you can get back to me, to give you some examples of unconscious bias. But I think unconscious biases are just automatic mental reactions that are programmed in us that we're not aware of. And that's why, it's unconscious or subconscious, right? We make decisions about things instinctively. And some of the things that I will describe when I can in this program, it will, I think, highlight very clearly, what we do and give examples of how unconscious bias affects everyone. I think that, it's just to give you some very generic things. You might say, and I'm just picking ethnic groups just for no reason, but you know, all people, Asians are good at X, or blank people buy Ford motor cars. You know, I mean, we make assumptions every day, and it's those kinds of things that we are programmed with through life and our culture and our upbringing that we then bring to the workplace, and when it gets executed, could result in decisions being made that have discriminatory impact against various groups. I mean, that's kind of the headline for me. So I'll turn it over to Rita and get her input, and then hopefully, Erin, we can come back and I can give you some examples of how this plays out in the workforce.
Yeah, just to really to add on that. So the way I look at unconscious bias, it's actually something that makes us who we are. It is our identity. In a way, it's something that we are born with, we're brought up with, our own family dynamics. What we hear from the age of when you're born onwards is something that really filters through and really defines our thought processes and how we think about things. I see now, I have 2 small children, and it's incredible. They're 5 and 7, but everything that I say, I'm on a phone call, they might hear my phone conversation or my husband speaking, they will lift off of that. You know, anything I say, they resonate with. They hear things at school, they resonate with. So it could be conversations that you're having at home that is, just be mindful of how you are phrasing things or how you are forming an opinion about something. Are you saying something based upon fact? Are you saying something just because you have a hunch about something? These are things that form opinions from a very, very young age. And not just that, this young age, the unconscious bias starts at toddlerhood, you know, when kids start making decisions for the first time. And then it goes through to the ages of 9 to 13, where these unconscious biases then become even more according to the gender of the child. Puberty hits in. So women, for example, start losing confidence and start using different body language because of these biases that they're unaware of, but that comes through puberty. And the same with men and boys. And this is research that's been shown time and time again. The reason I'm bringing this up is because this is what shapes what makes us who we are. On top of that, think about different cultural backgrounds as well. Now, we are in the US. It's a land where we have people from all over different countries that come here. But when you come here, you are bringing your own cultures with you. My parents are from the northeast of India originally, and I grew up in the UK. So the conversations I had at home weren't even in English. They were in Assamese, for starters, and they were very, very different. So I had to go, and I grew up in a very, I would say, a white neighborhood in the UK. I had to grow up with hearing things and almost putting on a different facade when I tried to go into school. People do this today. Everything that you do as a child kind of fast tracks and goes forward later on. We call these later on, we make them formal names. We call them microaggressions, where we stereotype by cultures, by neighborhoods, by socioeconomic backgrounds because of where people are brought up. Ultimately, this is who we are, and what we're trying to do in our unconscious bias training isn't to change people, isn't to say, well, you know, you can't change your thought processes. It's to make you aware that you have them and to be mindful and expand our minds, educate ourselves. So what are the different people's backgrounds? Where are they coming from? So really that sort of goes into your next question, Erin, I know you asked about, is one training enough? I would say absolutely not. And the reason is because of the fact that these are who we are and shapes our thoughts and beliefs. So I think of unconscious bias as really being like muscle memory. You know, trying to retrain the way we think, almost to think before you speak, to hold your thought before you go out there. Whether you are an introvert or an extrovert who's used to sort of going boom, 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 now we're all forced to take a step back and think about it. So what the training that we or other companies do tries to reinforce is that it has to be a regular process to get us to be aware of how our minds work so that we can change that thinking. You know, on average, and I know all of our, you know, most of our viewers from an HR background will agree with this, that it takes 5 to 6 seconds to form an opinion about somebody you meet for the first time. That is really an amalgamation of all of our biases that we stemmed in our life. It could be the way somebody says hello. You think, oh, I know what they sound like. It could be the way they conduct themselves. How do they elocuate their words? Whatever it is that you form an opinion about them. You know, there are statistics that shows that if somebody has a British accent, they sound more intelligent. I mean, personally, I love that, but that's not the reality. It's, you know, when you hear somebody's accent, how they speak, their vocabulary, you form an opinion. So all we do in our training is to kind of tell people that take a step back, be mindful, try to start with a blank slate if you can. Give people the benefit of the doubt when you start off. And that's really what unconscious bias is really all about.
So, and it sounds like what you were saying there is it's an important element of a training, but it's not, it can't be everything. It's not going to fully educate you on everything to do with diversity and inclusion. And Jeff, I know you had more that you wanted to add to that, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I do. And I think that when you're talking about training and you know, I don't know that diversity is a training topic per se. I mean, diversity is a concept that, you know, you want to achieve a diverse workforce. You know, inclusion is different. Inclusion is how do you incorporate people that are now in your workforce that are diverse into your workforce. I think the concepts of unconscious bias is the core of training, okay? And, you know, like when we do it, that is, if we can maybe we call it diversity and inclusion training, but unconscious bias concepts is a core part of that. So what I want to do is just give a couple of examples of what this means so the attendees can maybe get an understanding. There's more, but I'm going to focus on three concepts, three different unconscious biases, if you will. So one is called attribution bias, okay? You have in your mind, and by the way, I will say that what Rita said is right on with regard to, you know, making you aware of these issues is critical, because many people just perpetuate that they don't, you know, everything they do is fine. And then what you have to do is sensitize people to these concepts. So attribution bias is there's an in-group and an out-group, okay? Whoever is in, you judge them, okay? Individually, you make excuses for them. You know, if there's an out-group, you judge them by their stereotypes and you don't make any excuses for them. So you might, for example, I mean, let's say you forgot to call someone back, right? You know, if you forgot to call someone back, it's because you're busy. But if someone else forgets to call you back, it's because they're disorganized and lazy and they purposely didn't call you. So you kind of set up these, you know, mindsets and parameters. You know, another example would be, for example, if someone in your group, whoever that is, gets a DUI, right? You might say, oh, they're a good person and made a mistake. But if they're not in your group and they get a DUI, you're going to say that they're negligent and they should go to jail. And so you have these concepts of concepts in your in us, okay, where we make these judgments. And one of the things that we want to do is to figure out and tell people in the training how to break that down, how to make decisions to avoid this, because you can't get rid of this, which is some of the things that I think Rita said, but you can, I mean, maybe you can, I don't want to be that cynical, but the point is, I don't know that you have to be aware that when you're making certain decisions that these things might be playing a role. So, you know, another example is confirmation bias. That's the second one. And basically here, I'm going to share my screen and a lot of people may be familiar with this. So let's try and do that. So you can basically see here, you know, this was an ad for a Buick, and a youthful woman is standing outside on the phone saying to her friend says, I'm in the Buick. And the friend says, where are you? I don't see a Buick. You know, and the Buick is sitting right there. Okay. Now, you know, this is confirmation bias in the sense that, you know, people have perceptions about what a Buick is, and maybe that it's, you know, for old people or whatever, and that, you know, cool millennials don't drive a Buick. But, you know, think about that when you, in the workplace, confirmation bias comes into play when you say, let's say you didn't want to hire somebody and they're hired anyway, right? the first time, you're only going to pay attention to the mistakes to confirm, confirmation bias, what you already thought about them, and perhaps ignore everything else. And it could work the other way. You know, like let's say you wanted to hire somebody, maybe as against someone else, you're going to confirm everything they do is good. So this is another way that, you know, people's differences come into place. The third one that I want to bring into example is I'm also going to show on my screen, because I think this is something that comes into play probably most, and that's affinity bias. Okay, so here we have, you know, the board is interviewing, and they say, you know, frankly, Dinsdale, we like the look of you. Okay, so, you know, affinity bias is favoring people who are like you and have similar interests and backgrounds. And how does that come into play in the workplace? Well, you know, let's say you have an interview process, and you know, there's a protocol, and you're going through and you're interviewing all these people, and then somebody walks in and says to you that they went to the same university. Now, all of a sudden, the likelihood is you're going to bond over that. You're not going to go through the questions that you asked everybody else. You have an affinity with them. And why is it that you went to the same school? Well, it's probably because you have similar interests, similar identities, similar backgrounds, and you see it perpetuates the ongoing similarities. And it's a major cause of perpetuating hidden barriers in the workplace, right? So if you have an affinity for people who are like you, you're not going to incorporate people who are not like you. And, you know, this is a tendency that we have to do. We select people who we like to work with without really thinking about necessarily who might be the best person. So you may be excluding a significant number of people from work projects without giving them a chance. And of course, all of these play out in terms of race, religion, national origin as well. So by being aware, bringing this back full circle, by being aware and having this in your thought processes, you can avoid what is, you know, could be legal liability by discriminating against someone unintentionally because maybe you just had an affinity for them. So, I mean, that's a whole lot of stuff, but it's, you know, unconscious bias issues we can talk about this for a long time, but we have limited time. But I wanted to be sure to get you, you know, a couple of concepts so everybody kind of really understands what we're talking about in that regard.
I appreciate that, because I think it is something that so many people look for information on. And, you know, if you Google it, you'll find a million things. So it's nice to hear from the sources what that is. Rita, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just a quick, and I think Jeff covered it really well, actually. But so what the point I was making was that there are so many different types of microaggressions out there. You know, in this day and age, very current right now, we're all talking about prejudice, privilege, allyship, you know, systemic bias. These are all buzzwords right now. And it takes time to not just sort of scratch the surface and find out, okay, what is the textbook definition, but really understanding it. There is a difference to sort of in the box and saying, okay, I've done my training, I understand what systemic bias is, I can pass a test on it, to do I really understand it? Do I understand that my neighbor has a different experience leaving the house in the evening to go on an evening jog than I do, because it happens to be black? You know, I can just wear a hoodie, it's getting chillier, it's coming into fall. He can't, without thinking, is somebody following him or looking around the corner? You know, so it's things like that. And how do we get people to actually understand that? And that's why I think, again, going full circle, it's all about really the training and getting people to understand there are so many different facets of human nature, behavior within unconscious bias.
And I think that's important too. Like both of you, the way that you phrase that, it's about building the empathy for the other person and understanding their experiences and what they've been through and getting to know them on a deeper level than just saying, oh, you went to my university, or, oh, you're my neighbor, you live on the same street, so we must have the same experiences, that type of thing, which I think is eye-opening for some people. They don't take the time to consider that until recently for many. One thing I wanted to ask is we got a question here, which I think is a great question. And it's a practical question. So Rita, somebody wrote in, they said, Rita's accent is beautiful, but I'm learning not to ask people where they're from because they're concerned that they would be perceived as asking that they don't belong here. So does that mean they can never ask that again? And I think it's a practical question because people now are afraid to ask certain questions. How would you respond to that? How do you think people can go about that?
That's actually a really good question. And I think, again, it depends on where the person is from. For example, me, I love talking about my background. I like telling people, hey, I'm from the UK, I have heritage from Assam, no one's ever heard of Assam, so it's an excuse for me to tell everyone about it. So I love questions like that. Whereas when I moved to the US, I found that people were often cagey when I would ask them the question back. I was like, oh, so where are you from? Oh, I'm from New Jersey. I said, okay, but where's your heritage from? People would get offended. So then I understood that, people take that a very different way. So the way I've dealt with it, and then a lot of the trainings around that, is you start off first as being, if you're trying to find out, for example, I meet people that I suspect have other accents similar to mine, but I don't want to just assume. I've been out of the UK for a little while now, I might even get it wrong myself. So I would say that, hey, I'm, by the way, I love your accent. I'm from London. It's sort of similar. Have you ever spent time there? Rather than where are you from? Because they might feel put on the spot. You don't know how comfortable people feel. Sometimes people feel like bonds, as you mentioned, Erin, and as you mentioned, Jeff. So people will naturally then use that as a talking point, but not everyone wants to open up. So I think open up yourself first. And this is a great exercise for anyone who's in a leadership position who wants to build some sort of affinity or diversity group and broach the topic of how do you open conversations. Open up yourself, lead by example. So I do the same thing. If I want someone else to open up, I open up myself. I help them let down their guard by doing so.
I think that sounds great. It sounds like you make it a very safe space for the person to either engage, or they can also say, oh no, and just change the subject.
Totally.
Wonderful. What I wanted to also ask, and Jeff, I'm going to ask you this, is so often people are aware of issues that come up in their culture, or in their corporate culture, I should say, but they're not really addressing them. Are there any legal pitfalls if we ignore any discriminatory behavior or any issues within our corporate culture that we become aware of? Maybe we realize we're only hiring based on an affinity basis to our past universities or referrals. What do you think that way?
Yeah, great question. And Rita, I thought you were from Brooklyn, candidly, but glad you cleared that up. Legal pitfalls. Well, yeah, listen, I don't want to depress people, but everything that flows that we're talking about is in some way comes down from an umbrella that has legal written all over it. Okay, I'm sure everybody knows that discrimination is unlawful in every state and part of the country, and cities. They have more expansive, so not everything is covered everywhere, although it is expanding. But simply stated that there are legal claims that can be asserted that have nothing to do with intentional discrimination. So, for example, if a company terminates a Black employee, that employee may claim that they were discriminated against because of their race, right? And that's considered intentional discrimination. But there is also, and that's called disparate treatment, okay? There's also a concept in the law called disparate impact. And that is where neutral policies have a disparate impact on a particular ethnic group or protected category. It could be people of age, right? So, for example, it happens many times, and unfortunately, earlier this year, too often in terms of reductions in force, right? You pick a bunch of people to be laid off, but then when you look at the analysis, you see that 70% are 65 and over, right? Or they are 70% are Hispanic workers. You didn't intend to discriminate against, but you just made decisions. We need to lay people off. That can lead to a significant, legal problem of discrimination just on statistics. Okay, so when we're talking about, diversity, we're talking about unconscious bias. We're talking about, things that are within the umbrella of discrimination. And I will add, from many years of observation in the employment law arena, that when it comes to legal claims that I'd say most people who bring claims are bringing them because they're dissatisfied, disgruntled in some way. Many have merit, many don't, okay? Many claims, that is, right? And, you know, these concepts that we're talking about, achieving diversity, eliminating unconscious bias, will make for a better workplace and have a tendency to reduce the number of claims that can be brought, because people feel they're working in a, you know, a culturally progressive workplace. They feel better about themselves. They feel better about the company they work for, and are less likely to, you know, and this is, you know, not a scientific analysis, but just my own, you know, professional observation. So there's a lot of legal consequences here, and ones that could lead to significant liability if they're not done correctly. So, sorry.
But I think it's good for people to consider, and especially when you're talking about the reduction in forces that happened this year, you know, it was a time where people were crunched and they had to say, okay, this isn't a decision we ever thought we were going to have to make, and right now we just need to, you know, reduce the costs and figure it out. But it goes to show that even in those times, you have to take a step back and look at the impact it's having
Right.
on your organization.
I mean, just, you know, just one quick follow-up. I cannot tell you how many times I get a call from, let's say, whoever my contact is, the director of HR, right? And they have to do a reduction. So they go to the business units, and the business units make decisions like, oh, I want this people laid off, this people laid off. And they're not looking at it from a big picture perspective. And I say, so how did these decisions get made, and how come these people were selected? And nobody has like a sufficient justification. And then you look at the statistics, and it's like, whoa, it's skewed, you know, significantly against one ethnic group. And, you know, the business units don't always understand, you know, the big picture. So, you know, we have to drill down and have support, even though it's like economic and business is down, you still have to justify your reasons and be sure that, you know, because now on this side of the pandemic, if you will, claims are coming in where people are saying, well, I know you laid me off because of COVID, but you picked me because I was Black. You picked me because I was 66. You picked me because I just came back from pregnancy. You know, so we always have to keep these things in mind.
No, those are great points. And speaking of the current events that have been happening in the past 6 months, a lot of times another question I've been getting from employers is, can I gather my employees to have a conversation about the protests that are happening and all of the social justice issues that are going on? And Rita, I'm curious from your perspective, what do you think about that? Do you think that that's a smart move for employers, or is there a proper way they should address it?
Absolutely, and that's a great question. So here's the thing: you've got to know that your professional life and your personal life traditionally were always separate. In this day and age, things are starting to merge more, especially during lockdown, where your professional and personal life were one and the same in many cases. So that changed things a little bit as well. When you're talking about what's going on in the news currently and social justice issues, I think absolutely to be a better manager, to be a better leader, you should absolutely bring it up. But there's a correct way of doing it as well. So one thing you could do is, depending on your level of seniority, is just hold a town hall style meeting, whether it's, I guess, everything virtually at the moment, where you're sort of just asking people to share stories of how they feel. You could sort of email people if you're managing a team of people that you know come from a certain background that might have been affected by this. Ask them, how did that make you feel? Share something about yourself. You might be from a very different background and actually completely removed from it. You might be what people, quote unquote, call white privilege, but you're trying to help and you're trying to get involved and say, okay, well, I want to get involved in this. I have no idea how to. So one way of doing it is, look, I'm coming from a background which is obviously not the same as yours. And this is something that is very touching. I felt a lot by what I saw and what I heard. How are you feeling about this? Can you tell me a little bit of background of what you know your experiences? You can bring people together in a room, have like a round table, bring people together. People will share if they feel comfortable doing so. The experience I had when I was a child, and I used to bottle up my home life to my school life, doesn't happen so much anymore if people feel comfortable sharing. So if you open that safe space for them and say, look, this has been going on, how can we help? What can we do? Doesn't mean you have to change any of your business policies. That's a separate thing. It's more, how can you be an empathetic manager? How can you listen? How can you be the person to go to so they don't end up quitting and going somewhere else as well?
So it's more of showing the support and being a part of the conversation, and not even so much having the answers right then and there if they say, well, what are we doing about this as a company? But just saying, share with me, it's a safe space to express yourself.
And it's absolutely okay not to have the answer, and that's the point. You know, I think people like to see vulnerability at the moment. They like to see you're human as well. And just say, look, I don't know how to deal with this. I'm just sort of coming into this for the first time. Please give me some guidance.
Anything you want to add, Jeff? I think you might be muted, Jeff.
Yes, I was.
There you go.
People frequently ask that I mute myself. So anyway, a couple of things that I wanted to add to Rita's comments. And that is, you know, there's a lot of different ways to go about this, okay? I mean, some companies are a little reluctant to confront these issues directly and elicit, you know, what may become a floodgate opening of complaints and allegations and things of that. So, you know, it may not be for every company to hold a town hall. There are other ways. The other thing that companies need to consider are whether they're, you know, media-facing companies or, you know, consumer-facing companies. I'm sure, you know, many people saw on social media, you know, that a lot of companies responded to Black Lives Matters in ways that, you know, were consistent with their brand. And I think that that's important too. You know, you want to, if you're that kind of company, you probably have to be a little proactive in how you, you know, open up these conversations, because you don't want it, you know, you don't want to be reactive, right? And have somebody out there on Twitter saying about something about your company and you haven't had a chance to address them first. So, I mean, we have now that time, you know, maybe in June we didn't. It was very pressurized following George Floyd and all of that. So I think that's important. So other than like just coming right out, you know, and doing that, I definitely think, and most companies have, you know, discrimination complaint procedures, and having a vehicle. You know, we always want complaints to be brought internally, right? You don't want to end up, you know, for people in the local area on the cover of Newsday, right? You know, because then it's done, right? You want to encourage people to complain. But another way of going about this, and this is something that in some ways, you know, our own law firm is doing, and that is to make it more voluntary, I guess. Maybe send out information to your workforce about maybe topical TED Talks or other, you know, web information speakers that are out there. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, here's a source, you know, and soft selling people, giving them information. You know, you could have maybe a book club or, you know, give people, somebody could organize that depending on the size of your company. Maybe organize a book club for people who wish to, on a voluntary basis, learn more and discuss with their colleagues during lunch. You know, so there's a number of ways that companies can address social justice issues in the workforce. I think, you know, I would advise being cautious if a company wants to take a specific position, you know, about this issue, that they have to be mindful that their workforce is probably includes people who have a lot of different philosophies, and that may have its own, you know, repercussions. Not that they're not free to do so, but you know, that's something that you want to think about it. But I think that being ahead of the curve is always a good idea, and every company has to choose its own path, because there's no one size fits all when it comes to this.
And one thing I want to add to that I think fits in with both of what you were saying, and might be a little bit of a plug, but if you have an employee assistance program, whether it's us or it's someone else, that's always a great way to show your empathy for your employees and recognizing that they might be struggling, is contact your EAP and say, do you have any materials that we can share with our employees to remind them that they can reach out if they need someone to talk to. If they're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, you know, that's always a safe avenue to say, here, there's supports out here that we're providing for you. You know, and speaking of, Jeff, what you said about the book clubs and things like that, the other point that I wanted to get to, and I know we only have a couple minutes left here, these affinity groups. I know the time went quick, but these affinity groups, because this is something that, again, that I'm hearing a lot about, and how people can start them and what it could look like. Some people have never thought of the concept before. So maybe if you both want to spend a couple minutes talking to us a little bit about the experience you've had at Rita. I know you've started many and overseen them in organizations. Where could someone start with that?
So just to get started, so really that affinity groups is really stemming from the back of quite often social justice issues. There is something out there that people feel strongly about, and they form groups to do that. So actually, to respond to Jeff's point as well, that sometimes when it's not like a company policy, you don't want to go out there and make a public statement. You're just showing that you're supporting your employees. And one of the way of doing that is by having affinity groups. But you also have to be careful about how you do that too. What is the purpose of the affinity group? Is it a safe space? Is it so that employees from a certain background can bond with each other and have their own sort of meetings now and again, their own sort of internal Slacks chat groups or gatherings that they can have? Or is it really to bring awareness to what their culture, what their community does? An example being that one of the organizations I was brought in to fix was, for lack of a better way of putting it, they had a Black Lives Matter group set up. And they absolutely loved it. And their point was to say, look, we have only a few Black employees here. We want them to get together, and they come from different backgrounds. They want to celebrate their different cultures and different feasts and where their origins come from. Great. What some of the other employees were saying is that, oh my gosh, they're having these amazing cuisines and events. We're never invited. So I think that's the point. It was almost like they're forming a group, but they're segregating others or making other people feel segregated. So what you have to try and do when you form an affinity group is remember it's for the greater good ultimately for everybody. Invite in. You can spend time bringing up, talking about your cultures, your cuisines, things that is unique to you as a community, but give other people the chance to tell them about it, invite them in, educate them, have sort of forums where you can present to them, do, drama and culture. Music was very important in this particular community's background. I said, show them that. They are really craving to see that. They want to try some of this food you're talking about. Let's have that. Why don't we speak to your canteen maybe? Figure out a way, if there's one day or once a week, you can have these cultural days as an example. So there are different ways of doing it, but I think ultimately it works better for everybody if it's to bring people together and educate everybody else.
Wonderful. Anything you want to add to that, Jeff?
Sure. And, again, just going based off of experience, I mean, you can have groups like we have, a group for working moms. And that's just ramped up a little bit more recently because of the return to school and all the concerns. We have groups, LGBTQ groups. We have, Hispanic attorneys, those groups. But, it's intended to be whatever it is they want. Like Rita said, the company should support it and not necessarily run it or create it. But I think that one way to hopefully maybe avoid some of the issues that Rita brought up of exclusion of others is encourage these groups to have whether it's webinars or some kind of way today, in this era, to give information that may not necessarily even be about their group, but it could be like the XYZ Corp LGBTQ group is presenting a webinar on COVID-19 topics, just things that everybody would be interested in, but it doesn't always have to be like a secret meeting. It's there as a resource for them to rely upon or to share common experiences, but you can expand that and include others, which is part of the program here. It's diversity and inclusion. See, so how I work that in. So I would say that it's a great idea. It really, again, depends on the company and the culture of the company, meaning not, like where are you from, but the culture of the company and whether it really is ingrained in the fabric of the company, because, it just has to be that way to work. Otherwise, It's like square peg in a round hole thing.
Yeah, and I think that's important too. And if the leadership supports it, and if you have buy-in from the top, I imagine that would be easier to ingrain it in your culture rather than a company who's never taken the time to get to know its employees or to really look at the individual factors to just say, hey, you, why don't you start one of these groups? I think that feels much more forced.
My experience is that these groups start from like a grassroots kind of thing where people just organically get together and then they want to do something with it. So like they'll approach HR or whoever and say, listen, we have a group of people. What can the company do to support it? Is it okay if we meet in the cafeteria, and things like that. So usually that would be the way. So it's already got, traction. And then the company's just helping them out, instead of saying, no, no way, you can't meet. No, forget it. We don't support that.
Absolutely. So as we only have a couple minutes left here, but I wanted to ask if anyone from the audience has any questions that they want us to answer quickly, please feel free to type them in. But before we go, I also wanted to give you both a chance if there's anything else that you wanted to say that either we didn't get to or that you wanted to add on to. We'll call it our closing remarks. But Rita, is there anything that you wanted to add to all the wisdom that you've shared with us?
No, I think there's been some really great questions. So thank you everyone for sending those in. But I think that's what it's all about, everybody's taking ownership about themselves and what they can add to this. So I think having this discussion is actually very meaningful in opening doors to what can potentially be done in the future. But I think just sort of, if I were to give final points, if you're setting up some sort of a, stance on workplace inclusivity, diversity and inclusion, unconscious bias, just make sure you understand yourself, why you're doing it, figure out how you're going to do it and who is supporting it. And how are you going to sort of make this sustainable in the long run? Because these are very, very important keystones to make the foundation work now, be able to do this in the long term.
Thank you so much. And I think that why point is so critical for people because often they jump in without identifying that first. So I love that. And Jeff, anything that you want to add as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal is, to use a phrase that's used elsewhere, it's like interrupting, interrupting, whether it's discrimination, unconscious bias, recognize those times when, you are susceptible to doing it, whether, you're under pressure, you're in a stressful situation, you have to make decisions quickly, try to, be aware of when those situations are and slow down the decision-making process. Add a structure to the process. Be aware of how you could do it, and come outside of your comfort zone, and find commonalities with people who are not like you, and try to look at how things are going, and always put yourself in other people's shoes. I like the examples that Rita gave about with the hoodie and how our experiences are so different. And we can't begin to understand that. But if we start to everybody take responsibility for their own actions, it will inure to the benefit of your workplace. And it will, in the long run, from a legal perspective, create a definitely less risk. And then you don't need me.
Which is what we aim for.
Of course.
But thank you so much. I just want to thank you both, Rita and Jeff. You taught me so much today. I imagine that our listeners will learn so much as well. We've held on to a good number of them, so I always think that's a good sign. If anyone would like to speak with Rita or Jeff, if you are interested in learning more about them, please feel free. You can email me at info@nationaleap.com. It's the easiest email address, and I will certainly link you directly to them. I thank you both so much for all the effort that you put into creating this webinar and this panel, and for helping us and all of the companies, I should say, who are on the line with us today, hopefully to make their workplace cultures a more inclusive and comfortable environment for everyone. So thank you both. I hope you have a great day. We have some nice weather, so let's enjoy it. And again, anyone, please feel free to send us any questions or comments, and I can connect you directly to Rita and Jeff.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Rita.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.